Hello, it is September 2016, and this is episode 58 of the Unseen Podcast. This is your host, Paul Carr, and with me tonight are, from left to right on my screen, Chris Prophet.
Hi there.
And James Garrison. James, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
And from Sam, I think you're in Hong Kong, right? Sam Lichtenstein.
Hello.
Hello, Sam. You there?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. Well, tonight's kind of a grab bag, but we thought we'd start with what's going on in the nuclear fusion world. Now, nuclear fusion is something that has been known about for generations, and it's always seemed like a great idea for generating power that is totally carbon free. No CO2 goes into the atmosphere. There are some wastes, but the nasty waste problem you get with fission is not nearly as bad. But fusion is really hard to do. Chris Prophet, tell us why fusion is so hard to do and why it's better than fission.
Well, where to begin? The fusion itself, you can produce 10 times more power with fusion than you can fission, and fission is already a huge power source. So its potential is just, well, you can't hardly imagine a world where you have that amount of energy kicking around it, and it could effectively be enormously cheap, basically. But as I say, you need huge pressures and temperatures to generate conditions where elements will fuse. So it's very difficult to obtain, because I think the problem has been that we think you've got to have a continuous process. You know, that's how we have our generators work, where you produce these pressures and temperatures and maintain them, and then you have a continuous flow of energy out from it. That's been the big hold-up, and that's why it's always sort of 30 years in advance, because those temperatures and pressures are just, they're obscene.
It's basically the same temperatures and pressures that you have at the center of a star, right? Like our sun.
In the center of the sun, yes.
Yeah, with an unimaginable amount of mass squeezing down on it at high temperatures. Okay, so how do we get there?
Okay, contrary to public opinion, which is, I think, take a big science approach, the 30 years in the future approach, where you just have bigger and bigger and bigger machines, you've got to say, well, hang on, where are we heading with this? In 100 years, what will we have? We'll have found out so much about fusion and different ways and approaches, like doing it with lasers and tokamaks and Z pinches or whatever. What is the end result? And there's a group out there in LPP land, Lawrencville Plasma Physics. We just have a small lab, as I understand it. They have under Eric Lerner, who's a long-time physicist, astrophysicist. They have a device called focused fusion there. Now, it's kind of like a Z pinch. I don't know if you're familiar with a Z pinch. It's where you make a beam and you squeeze it down. Yeah.
Well, and here in the United States we call it a Z pinch. But yeah, okay.
A Z pinch. Okay, that's probably what we're losing in translation.
Or a zeta pinch. Yeah.
Yeah. You get a beam and squeeze it down and try and get those fusion temperatures in it. But it's messy. If you produce those temperatures, I think they did that recently out in Russia. You destroy the electrodes. You're putting so much power through it that it just melts the electrode. So it's not reproducible. You're never going to get that continuous process. But I say the Eric Lerner stuff, it seems to be the next step on. He seems to have thought about how to do that long-term generation where it doesn't break down, and the answers he's come up with are quite quite promising, to be honest. If you look at the results, that they've actually achieved fusion, which is more than a lot of private
Now, how do you verify that you achieve fusion?
Well, they have various instruments and temperatures, and they can actually, I understand, they can see the energy output. This is one of the problems. They've got fusion, and their process they use, this focus fusion, it produces a plasmoid, basically, an ultra dense magnetic constriction. It doesn't pinch in a z-axis along a line, along a beam. It makes a ball, a sphere. It grabs about 6 inches of plasma in the chamber, and then very quickly compresses that down to about a couple of thousandths of an inch across. And the plasma is so dense, essentially it's solid plasma. Right. And the temperatures, a couple of billion degrees, but only very briefly, for about 10 nanoseconds.
Now, is this deuterium or tritium?
Well,
what kind of shots are these?
Yeah. At the moment, they're using deuterium and nitrogen, and they're getting temperatures to fuse. Now, it's only temporary, but none of the equipment breaks down in between the shots. So what happens is they get fusion with it. And that fusion, because of the magnetic constriction, produces the energy is sort of extruded. One end electrons come out, and the other end of the plasmoid helium ions come out. So all they have to do, you know how they produce beams in the collider. They have a magnetic device which projects beams. Well, they just do that in reverse. They take these beams, put it through a high-tech sort of a magnetic transformer, and they produce electricity out of it. So straight away, they have some huge advantages over normal fusion there, because one, you don't need that massive heating water, putting it through a turbine, cooling the water down, right? That just goes. That's how we've been doing it since Edison's time. Even nuclear reactors have water heaters and turbines. So that's all gone. Also, the process is aneutronic. Now, people think, nuclear, that's going to be radioactive. Now, yes, nuclear fission is, and a lot of the fusion projects, the big science stuff like the ITER and the NIF, that's using tritium and deuterium. That produces neutrons. That is radiation. Their process, what they're aiming towards, is aneutronic. In other words, you create something without producing neutrons, without any radiation.
Well, yeah, I understand that's highly desirable, but because the neutrons mess up everything around it. But
that's what causes the breakdown of the equipment. Why you can't.
How do they not produce neutrons from deuterium?
Well, it's a sort of soft. It's an ecological fusion, basically. What they aim to do is have boron and hydrogen, just plain boron, hydrogen, two really common elements, and then they achieve their fusion temperatures in the plasmoid, and then that produces helium nuclei, which go out on the beam on the one direction, electrons in the other direction, and the helium has got a neutron and a proton, I understand. So you've got it's not radiation. It just comes out. You're creating something rather than destroying. Right, with air fusion, it's pretty interesting. I must say it's the most valid effort I've seen so far. They seem to just, instead of the brute force approach of say NIF, ITER, they seem to have thought about it. They've looked at the quantum side. They've looked at the magnetic side. One of the problems they have with a lot of the tokamak style fusion approaches is that those magnetic fields, they're inherently turbulent. They break down. You're trying to constrain that energy and just hold it in place as a continuous effect. But they say, well, hang on a moment. Well, why don't, instead of trying to fight nature, why don't we use it? Because the effect they use is they put about 1.1 megaamps through the cathode and anode. It's like a hand outside of a cylinder, and the streamers of electricity go from the cathode to the anode, and they form a sort of sheath. And because of the magnetic effect, they get all bundled up together, they twist together and form this plasmoid. Now, yeah, it only lasts for sort of 10 nanoseconds, but you can take that energy straight away that it outputs, dump it into capacitors, and then use some of the energy yourself, and the rest of the energy you can fire the next shot. So 10 nanoseconds recharged.
Okay, we have to ask the due diligence questions here. That would explain why VCs are not climbing over each other to fund this stuff, right?
Well, it does have a small amount of VC funding, as I understand, and maybe some crowdsourced funding. But we're talking a very small amount of money. I think just a couple $1 million.
Yeah, which I mean, you can get that much with an iOS app, right?
I mean, they're not flavor of the month. Let's face it.
Grindr probably got more money than that, right?
It's just mad because their approach seems to be most valid, and they're getting least money.
Let's talk about the validity, okay?
Yeah, sure, fire away.
What has been independently verified of what they're doing? What have they published in the literature?
Well, I think they published in the literature in 2013, and it was the most read article. I forget the name of the journal, and amongst sort of plasma physics journal, and they've just come back from Prague, I believe it is, where their results were basically the best of all the plasma physics out there, as far as I can see. Well, at least from their website anyway, but they would say that, I suppose. But everybody seemed to be very interested in what they're doing because they just seem to be taking it on to another step, whereas people out there are still playing around with Z pinches and trying to get the fusion to work in a sort of... I mean... It's been around for quite some time, the dense plasma focus. I think it was like 64 it first came around. But people, it's what to do with it, how to use it to get that fusion effect. I mean, yeah, the fusion they've got out of it, it's not high. I think it's like a quarter of a joule, but they are achieving it. And there's other private companies like, I think it's Tri-Alpha and General Fusion. They haven't had any fusion at all. And the results they're getting are really quite good. They're getting repeatability. That's the main thing.
Well, now the Europeans with their tokamaks have gotten break even back in the 80s, right? Or in early 90s, I guess.
Yeah, but it's the that radiation problem. As soon as you have put tritium and deuterium in those and you start having fusion, you've got radiation, and the radiation is just chewing up the inside of those tokamaks. So you can't get reproducibility.
But I mean, the tokamaks were never meant to be commercially viable reactors, right? They were meant to be proof of concept.
Yeah, exactly. Back in the 1960s, when they're invented, they don't seem to have taken it on. They say, "Oh, well, it's just too easy what they're doing at the moment." They're sort of saying, "Oh, well, how do we make fusion? Well, if we put 192 lasers onto a pellet, we'll create fusion." Yeah, but what do you got? You've just got a very small. Well,
no, you're confusing the lasers with the tokamaks. That's it. The National Ignition Facility did a proof of concept that you could use lasers to create fusion, and they did that with a lot of lasers in a great giant facility, but they never really advertised that as anything other than a proof of concept, right? I mean, that was. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's what I understand. They said they were going to do it. They could have done it, and they never really got anywhere near it. I think, say.
Well, they did get the deuterium pellets to fuse.
They got it to implode, but I'm not sure they actually got any sort of real fusion that you were writing home about. I mean, as I heard that they just packed up. Basically, they said no, there's not much point in continuing because
well, I mean, that was
practical.
incredibly expensive experiment.
Oh yeah, it was. But it seemed to step out. It went out. They took the wrong approach to it. You can never use it to produce nuclear energy that could be harvested. So I say that's the brute force approach. But the Lawrenceville plasma physics, the focus fusion, that is very serious. I mean, to do away with 9/10 of the actual structure you need, the infrastructure for a generating station. They're talking about you could have one of these generators on a street corner, and you could power like 10 blocks, and it's the size of a room, your living room. It's nothing. It's the real high tech approach to how to fix this problem. Well, as far as I can see.
But now Lawrenceville plasma physics does not have a generator producing power, right?
Well, no, but one of the thick problems they currently have is that they're using tungsten electrodes at the moment. So they're testing it to see how high they can drive the temperatures. And one of the problems is that it produces this beam of electrons out of it, and this at one end, and the helium nuclei at the other. But these beams are actually eroding the electrodes because there's no way for them to escape. So you're getting tungsten introduced into the plasma as a sort of a trace element, and that's stopping the fusion. So the next iteration, they're going to a beryllium cathode, I believe, with a tungsten anode. They've got to have like an annulus in it to extract the energy, because the energy is actually now stopping the fusion process because it's putting impurities into the plasma. So they are generating some power, and they're now having to sort of cater for that in the setup of the equipment, and it's all really small. It's compact.
Okay, I still have the problem of why are billions of dollars are not being poured into this.
So
I have that problem.
To bring in the kind of skeptical view, it looks like from the few sources we've been able to find online that the critics suggest that what he's done is reproduce a standard this dense plasma focused reactor, and presumably engineers who've thought about commercializing fusion have modeled that type of reactor in the past and come to the conclusion that it's not commercially viable. And so the question is whether or not he's produced some generally novel scientific results that would call the traditional view of this type of reactor into question.
Okay, but let's go to full disclosure here. This person, Eric Lerner, who's the chief scientist there, he's produced some science that has been completely falsified in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Has he not?
Take your word for that. Go on.
Well, we're talking about the his The Big Bang Never Happened book.
Mm-hmm. He claims that it was a plasma photonic energy that created the universe, something like that.
So if nobody else has done what they've done, you have to be skeptical. The guy has produced bogus science
skeptical
before.
About the Big Bang.
Yeah, Brian Cumberland has an excellent article on why. I'll put it in the show notes. Why the electric universe, the plasma universe thing that is been falsified, and yet he still stands by it.
Well, I understand that some of the theories he's got for the focus fusion device, he actually created from his studies of quasars and whatever. You were saying, well, what is actually going on there electrically and magnetically, and then use those theories. Said, well, hang on a moment, we can actually use those on Earth to make something which could produce fusion.
Yeah, but everybody knows that in astrophysics, magnetics are incredibly complicated and extremely hard to model.
Exactly.
And so to claim that we know what's going on there in enough detail to engineer it is you got to be skeptical about that.
Well, absolutely. But if you've got any sort of hypothesis and something that even comes close, and you can test that out here on Earth, well, why not? all I can say is that, when they switch to beryllium, there's only one use for beryllium, and that is for fusion. They've spent a lot of money on that to import that. I don't know. It was from its source. I think it was Kazakhstan, and they had a lot of problems with import controls because, of course, they're saying, "What are you using it for? You can only use it for fusion." And he says, "Well, we're using, for fusion bombs." And he says, "Well, we're using it for fusion." So I'm sure they had an interesting discussion there.
Actually, beryllium, though highly toxic, makes terrific bearings. That's
interestingly. There's also a recent. It's not related to fusion at all, but in nuclear physics, there's a beryllium decay anomaly that's been discovered recently. We can put the link in the discussion of it.
Yeah, I did see that. That's still very cutting edge right now. I'm not sure.
It might be worth talking about at some point in the future, but it's quite interesting.
My understanding is that these kinds of fifth force things usually go away with more analysis, but
I think they've attained some impressive statistical significance in this case. But
well, I look forward to hearing more about that.
But to get back on topic, I just point out that the fact that Eric Lerner is a bit of a kook does provide an explanation for why so little funding has been forthcoming. And in fact, it's surprising to me that JPL even funded the initial phase of this work in the late 90s. Of course, the fact that they subsequently cut off funding is perhaps bearish for the project. But
well, I think they were told to by Congress. They said, NASA, what are you doing in fusion research? Get out of it.
JPL is not NASA.
Right.
JPL is Caltech.
All right. Well, I still think that Congress had something to do with it. On the website, he did quote NASA. All right, but go on.
Yeah, well, Lerner kind of, in terms of like the circles I run in, he kind of falls under the people that are proponents of free energy machines, the perpetual motion machines, that he's kind of regarded in the same vein, just because he's been making some pretty outrageous claims for a while. And as I was trying to remember why the name was familiar, but for a while he's been claiming that he can have fusion power as a viable source in 12 to 18 months.
Okay, to wrap this up, let's ask the question. Let's assume that Eric Lerner is not a kook, that he's the only one who's got it figured out. How would we know? What would they do that would demonstrate that they've got it right and everybody else has it wrong?
Well, in September, they're planning to have their big upgrade. They're working out a lot of the problems with the impurities in the plasma, which is, of course, essential. So this month, they're putting the new cathode and anode, at which point they can introduce the boron and the hydrogen, and they're producing energy. So how much energy they produce, I say, it's going to be the bottom line, whether it's real or not. I mean, they're saying that the current is really important. They're going to jump from sort of 1.1 megaamps to 2.8, at which point they'll get 70% of the energy concentrated in the plasmoid, where it's like 20% at the moment, because it increases by squares. So if they can do that, then that's going to be one dense plasmoid. Either it'll work or it won't. I suppose we'll know by Christmas.
Would it be
for the smoking crater?
Yeah. Well, at least it won't be radioactive. All right, go on.
Does anybody want to offer odds on, say, an important development in this area coming, say, by 2020? I mean, I guess I would put it in one. Pardon?
Well, it's less than one.
Less than one? Yeah.
Yeah, well, almost all probabilities are slightly less than one, or even more.
I was going to say, I put it at a few percent, probably, maybe 5%, probably less. It's my subjective.
I agree with you on that.
I mean, the money they've had, you'd be very surprised if they did actually manage to turn out something, but they might be able to turn out enough to attract some serious investors. I think the
Yeah,
figure's like
I would
5 million.
count that
Yeah.
as success for them, right? So I'm saying I think I would say
What do you
they're
class as
unlikely
success?
to attract significant investment within the next couple of years.
Well,
But
my idea of success is if they can prove that they can actually do a sustained fusion reaction.
Well, that's the point of it. That everybody's saying, "Oh, we must have sustained fusion." You don't have to. You only need to produce that plasmoid blip, and then you can sort of rest a couple of milliseconds, and then do another one because you're producing so much energy there. As long as you can store that energy, you don't need sort of. I get what you're saying though. You want to see a continuous process of fusion events rather than fusion non-stop.
Well,
Yeah.
I think what James means is something that could actually produce at least
Net
at
energy.
small scale
Sustainable.
power, which
Yeah.
I think is that's what. But the thing is, the steps are show that the physics works. A, B, show that you can engineer something small scale, and then C, scale it up. And the last two steps are engineering. The first step is physics, and nobody's gotten past the step A yet.
Well, I think you still got slightly tied up with the old way of thinking. You think about scaling up; they're thinking about scaling down. Right? You can. There's no reason why you can't have this any size. Right? I mean, you could have it in a car, in a plane. It's that small. Right? If they manage to get that.
Yeah, but we got to before we can make claims like that, we have to get to where we show the physics works. Right.
I'm confused. Well, why do you say the physics doesn't work? I mean, the basic nuclear physics seems well understood that these are positive energy producing reactions.
Well, no, what I'm saying is the particular process that they're claiming this.
They're engaging.
Yeah. It's got it. We know fusion works, and in the lab we can make lots of different nuclei fuse. The only aneutronic nuclei that I'm aware of that fuses are helium-3.
There's actually a whole list on the Wikipedia page of aneutronic fusion reactions. It's more than I'd realized. It's not just an obscure thing. It's quite a few.
Well, I'm okay. I will defer.
I have no expertise in this area. Just I find the Wikipedia page interesting.
But
well, and nobody's really going into it. That's the problem. I mean, you can't understand something which nobody does.
I think that until you actually, in an accelerator lab with ideal conditions, you can create a very tiny amount of fusion, and you can measure what comes off that, and you can verify that. But and that's been done for a lot of different nuclei. But we're talking about extremely small amounts of nuclei fusing basically just by smashing them together, which is not something that could work for a reactor, right? You'd have to have, just smashing them together with accelerators isn't practical. So
what I like about the project is everything about it is creative. Everything is positive. You're taking common elements, so you've got no price on the fuel. Basically, you've also got no radiation. It's aneutronic. Even the process itself, it reminds me of fission in some way, because they say if you can get these dense plasmoids at a high enough temperature, you get one boron to break down into helium, and that will chain react onto another one. So everything inside the plasmoid gets fused essentially. So it's very much like fission, but without all the radiation and the fallout and the nuclear waste. I'm very positive about it. I'm glued. Seeing what's going to happen this month. I was hoping they'd have something posted, but nothing yet, as far as I can see. I think they're going to prepare a paper.
Well, we're
Nice.
very good at fission. We've been doing that since the 40s. And fission is unstable, but but you know the and I just found the page that Sam was referring to. There is a proton boron fusion that's aneutronic, but it only produces 8.7 MeVs.
I don't know. Those particular energy outputs, I don't know how to interpret them because
Well, I mean,
you have to know something about the scale of the number
the
of
higher
reactions
the
taking
better.
place. Obviously, the higher the better, right?
Deuterium and tritium produce much higher, but still it's pretty efficient in terms of mass. So anyway, let's turn to a different topic. I think we've kind of maybe exhausted our expertise on this one. Actually, my expertise was exhausted after 2 minutes. But now, Sam, we talked about a little bit about AIs, artificial intelligences, and remind me exactly what it is that we wanted to.
Well, James had actually suggested there's a recent proposal the European Union's been considering regarding designating and regulating robots and artificial intelligence as so-called electronic persons. And the actual text of their proposal, I'm not sure how interesting it actually is, but maybe the broader ethical questions it's trying to engage with are somewhat interesting. Like, can you punish a robot? Can you punish people for being mean to robots?
Well, yeah, you go into hell and you start removing its modules.
I mean, it depends on what they're going to determine as what they're going to allow under the classification of electronic personhood, too, because if they just say robots in general, that includes manufacturing robots, that includes robotic vacuum cleaners,
robots,
In the text I looked at, they specify something about smart robots. And here are their characteristics that they use to define this. Acquires autonomy through sensors and or by exchanging data with its environment. I think that applies to basically all robots.
That's Roomba. Yeah, Roomba does that.
It's self-learning, an optional criteria.
Or Woomba as well.
So the second criterion is self-learning, which I think applies to a very broad class of artificial intelligence.
Mice can do that, yes.
Yeah. Has physical support. So that's saying something about the physical characteristics. I'm not sure. And adapts its behaviors and actions to its environment, which again I think applies to basically anything
mice.
Yeah.
So basically, it can't be mean to mice anymore.
So their specific criteria seem quite ridiculous to me, but you can imagine that somebody tried to. So those are just the characteristics a smart robot might have. They're not proposing a precise definition.
Well, this is a problem. We've never accurately, we've never even come close to defining intelligence at all. Do we know what intelligence is? How do we define it for robots? How do we define it for Millennium Man?
And when it comes to moral decision making, I think a lot of people would argue that consciousness might be more important than intelligence per se.
But we don't know what that is either, right?
Exactly.
From a legal point of view, nobody has an idea what consciousness is. I don't have an idea what consciousness is.
I mean, classically, you'd say, does it have a soul? When an AI dies, does it go to heaven? But no. I don't. No.
Because neither do humans.
Well, I don't think I'm going to heaven.
Well, not you, James. You've had.
Anyway, so I find the whole question of the government getting involved, certainly at this stage, to be quite ridiculous. But certainly, people have been thinking more and more about AIs as moral agents. And for example, there was this game put out by MIT recently called The Moral Machine, which essentially asks people to solve a number of trolley problems of the sort that a driverless car might be confronted with. For example, if you can't stop your driverless car, should it run over 2 old ladies or 1 baby? You know, and it's trying to elicit people's moral intuitions about how to solve seemingly irreconcilable moral conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, those are.
Which one's crying more at that point?
The old lady or the baby?
Well, it depends on whose baby it is.
Yeah. Also depends if you're in the old woman's will or not.
Well, no, James, this sounds like a joke, but reality is that, yeah, it's always more complicated. It's always more complicated than that, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's never just like the kind of academic things that show up in philosophical problems are never. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, there are interesting things like, should it matter whether one of the pedestrians you might hit is breaking the law by crossing the street when the
jaywalking?
Well, I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, where that's always the case. So, because nearly all of them come from some other country where jaywalking is not only legal, it's a moral obligation.
It's quite interesting to go to Tokyo. Is completely the opposite of that. It seems essentially unheard of to go to jaywalk in Tokyo.
Well, see, around here, you never see anybody in the crosswalks. They're always crossing the middle of the street or something like that. No one knows what the crosswalks.
Well, the cool kids do not use the crosswalk. That's for sure.
It's fun jaywalking. We don't really have it in the UK. When I came over to the States, I like walk out, when it says stop, and the police straight away says, "Oh, you're jaywalking." I said, "Oh, really?" And he's got his gun, and you shouldn't do that. I can tell you're a tourist though, so it's okay.
Well, we shoot jaywalkers over here.
Oh yeah, extreme prejudice.
You get 3 points for each one, but anyway.
No, I shouldn't worry about the fact that American cops have guns. Most of them don't plan to shoot you.
Most of them never even pull the trigger.
Yeah. I wasn't so much intimidated.
The ones that will shoot you will.
Sure. Yeah. Go on.
The ones that will shoot you would have shot you if they weren't cops anyway. So.
Now we get onto a different subject altogether.
No. Okay, I'm sorry about that distraction. The question is. Right. The moral choices that you have to make sometimes in real life. Let's forget about these academic constructs.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to forget about it. I mean, I think Sam has a good point. There are, if you put people in front of fairly abstract moral choices, like do you run over 2 old ladies or 1 baby, which you never really have in real life, but people will make choices that they often find very difficult. And the question is, could an AI make a choice
but
that
here's an actually slightly interesting. So my intuition when confronting these sort of questions was, some sort of basically utilitarian type analysis. Try to maximize the amount of human lives that you save, something like that. But some people had the very different intuition that the purpose of the software on a self-driving car should be to maximize the welfare of the person riding in the car at all costs. That people buy a device expecting it to protect them, which could produce vastly different outcomes,
That's true. Mm-hmm. I mean, it may involve running over the baby because it's better for the passenger.
Yeah, right. If
you
run over the old lady.
The old lady has 1 year to live.
All this.
And the baby might be even if the baby's like, the next Mozart.
Could also be the next Hitler, right? I mean,
well, we don't know, right?
Oh, don't start the AIs on that.
Oh, now we're into Godwin's law.
Oh, God.
It always goes to Hitler, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. The AI cannot possibly know these things. You and I couldn't possibly know, right?
Let's not bring Godwin's law into this.
That's the next thing you should ask Colin about is Hitler.
No, he's got an opinion on Hitler. Trust me.
I want to hear
I guess
it.
a meta question here is whether you'd expect the absence of, say, government regulation, the market to solve this type of question in a reasonable way. You know,
Oh no, no way.
I don't
I'm
expect.
not so sure. I'm not so
Well,
sure.
I
For
think it's
example,
kind of moral choice.
one market outcome might be that everybody buys
Yeah.
self-driving cars that maximize the safety of the passenger.
But are these
and
kinds
that's
of
not necessarily a terrible equilibrium, you know?
are these kinds of value judgments rational at all? I mean, aren't they just value judgments? And whose value judgments
and a
are
value
they?
judgment's not always, and a value judgment's not always rational. Depends
Well,
on the
at
circumstance.
its heart, it's never rational, right? I mean, it always
Right.
involves. I mean, you know, like you take a veteran who's suffering from PTSD, he doesn't value his own life very much because it's horrible for him. You take other people would always value their own lives above everything else. So, you know, where is the, you know, and are any of these things rational in any kind of universal sense? I don't know that they are.
I mean, I think your basic point strikes me as self-evidently correct, but it also is kind of risks descending into nihilism when it comes to public policy, because I think there are some moral decision theory areas in which there's very clearly like rational. You know, for example, before we started recording, we were discussing vaccination policy. You know, I think most people's moral intuitions about that are completely based on a utilitarian calculus involving things like herd immunity and stuff like that. You know, and we certainly believe that rationality comes into.
Well, I have conflicts about that, even though I think vaccination is a completely irrational thing to do. And I get my kids vaccinated 100%, all the way up, everything that the doctor says they need, right? But
the compulsory aspect.
But when do I feel like I would use force to make somebody else get their kids vaccinated? That to me is a hard choice.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to claim these types of issues are easy necessarily, but just that to some extent you can engage with them at least partially through a kind of rational analysis.
Yeah, but there's always a background of value judgments, isn't there? I mean, we always say, you know, and if we want our robots to make value judgments, they're going to have values, aren't they?
Right, but I think the point is that there's some values are sufficiently uncontroversial, such as human life is worth preserving. And I realize you pointed to edge cases such as severely depressed or traumatized people where those values can kind of be called into questions, but like they say that hard cases make bad law.
Well,
you want to get the easy cases right, you know?
Yeah, I agree with that. But there are things that would be uncontroversial, like if you see that a baby is about to get destroyed by a car, you can push the baby out of the way. You push the baby out of the way. I don't think anybody would argue with that, right? But it's still a value judgment.
Mm-hmm.
It's still there's some small risk for me to grab that baby carriage and pull it out of the way. But even if the risk is zero, it's not a value judgment. It's just, well, yeah. I mean, why would you want to deal with that? But it's still an emotional thing, right? It's still based upon what we humans regard as important or of value in, you know, we don't want to see a baby die, for example. That's an emotional judgment. So at the base of all this, there is a moral judgment that is not, you can't draw a foundationalist policy and say, here's the axiom. You have to say, this is something that humans value because humans are humans. Now, do we make our robots have the same values, or do we, how do we get the robots to say, for example, the old lady who has 1 year to live is less valuable than the baby who could either be the next Mozart or the next Hitler, but he's a baby and he's got many, many years to live. You know, how did the robot do that calculus? That's the problem that because we don't know how to do that ourselves.
I mean, as far as I can see it, the only way you can teach a robot that is to mature it the same way a person sort of grows up. I mean, we do our best with what we know. Whether it's perfect morals or not, probably not. But we try. We make an attempt based on our experience. This is why I think AIs are still quite a way off, because there's just basically no way you can give it that sort of impetus to have some sort of moral choices, unless you give them a life of experience.
Well,
basically.
here's a moral choice though that humans might make. We find if our studies show, I don't know if this is true or not, but let's say our studies show that if we went to all autonomous vehicles without any human drivers, that the number of lives saved in terms of highway accidents would be greatly, there would be so many lives saved that it's worth it, right?
I'm not sure how strong the statistical evidence for that is, but I certainly have a very strong prior that that's true. And
that's my prior as well.
Right now, it's one death in over 1 million miles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and eventually we would have some empirical.
Which is.
Yeah. I mean.
Orders of magnitude.
I don't know if it's actually orders of magnitude better. I think it's actually the sample size is too small to say.
Well, I mean, you'd have no drunk drivers for one thing. That cuts out what 40% of the deaths, something like that. You'd
We're
have
talking about a lot of deaths, by the way, but not that many in the grand scheme of things. I think it's on the order of tens of thousands per year in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, you only hear about the bad stuff, like one person died from an impact which an autonomous driving would prevent. I mean, I read on Elon Musk tweets the other day there was a car in Washington, and a bloke stepped out in front of it in the dark wearing dark clothing, and the autonomous vehicle put on the brakes and stopped it just on the bumper. Now, the driver said he would never have seen it. He could have never reacted that fast. See,
the one that hit the semi truck, though, it was a white cargo. It was a white car there was a white trailer on it, and it just happened to make it impossible for the optics to distinguish between the sky and the semi truck trailer. And plus, the guy was, from what I've heard, he was notorious for not, it's assisted driving, it's not full autonomous, but he was just letting the car drive him.
Yeah, okay.
He'd be playing video games and stuff like that.
What I find most concerning about this is that our societal software, if you will, our legal system, I don't think anybody is confident that it's really up to the task of kind of handling these sorts of things correctly, Nobody has very strong intuitions about whether Tesla should be responsible for that legally liable for that software bug, or whether it's the driver's fault, or whether it's just an act of God, a sort of random thing.
No easy answers, right? We're gonna have to struggle through this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the only way to evolve something from it is that classically drivers are responsible for their vehicle. That's the law at the moment. Yeah. Now, it hasn't been changed, so even though technically he sort of devolved his responsibility to a computer, I mean, he's still it. He's still in the hot seat.
I don't know whether that's even inscribed in how much of the legal framework is inscribed in legislation versus just common law principles. And even if you believe in common law in general, maybe not all of it actually applies in a world in which we're involved.
Well, see, that's why you got to give the EU some credit, though, because they're actually trying to they're trying to be proactive on, once you do have autonomous robots. So they're trying to be proactive and try to set up a blueprint that we can build, that people can build off as the systems get more advanced.
Yeah. I mean, AI, the potential is fantastic. I mean, they had an accident out on SLC 40 where the rocket blew up during the week. If they'd had an AI monitoring all the feeds on that, it could have reacted fast enough to maybe do something about it, cut off the fuel supply before it blew up, whatever. But humans just simply can't react that quickly. So, potential. Well, it's just, it's
well, let's
box.
look at this. This is in the U.S. only. I apologize to my foreign listeners I shouldn't say foreign, my non-U.S. listeners but in the U.S. in 2014, which I think is the latest statistics we have, about 10,000 people were killed in drunk driving accidents in the U.S. That was 31% of all the traffic deaths. I'm sure there were quite a few, from my experience here in the D.C. area. I often see people on their cell phones who are not paying attention to what they're doing.
God.
Really, I mean, it's horrible here. And so I'm sure that's at least in the rest of the 50%. So I'm sure we could cut out, because the AI would never flag its attention and would never be drunk. You could cut out at least half the traffic fatalities. Probably in the U.S. alone, 15,000 people a year would.
Also, it's worth emphasizing something I learned on Malcolm Gladwell's podcast recently. It's just a striking illustration of the fact that people are in fact just pretty bad at operating cars. It's the fact that most of the publicized cases of uncontrolled acceleration that led to all those Toyota recalls a few years back. The consensus among automotive experts is that they are just people pushing the wrong pedal. They thought they couldn't brake, but they just had their foot. They thought they were pressing the brake, and they were pressing the accelerator, and they freaked out. So, humans just aren't good at
cruise control came
out. I'm too young to remember that.
When cruise control first came out, people thought it meant it would control the car, so they'd turn on the cruise control and read a newspaper.
That will get you killed very quickly. That's a Darwin
that's
Award.
Actually what happened. People
that'll get you as a headline.
Yeah.
So we're talking about saving tens of thousands of lives. So that's hundreds of billions of dollars in utility, according to sort of conventional economic estimates. It's not just
as long as the AIs don't kill us all. That's a plus.
Yeah. Well, see, that brings up a point right there, though. Recently here in the U.S., we had police department use it was a bomb detonation robot, but they used it to blow up a guy that shot. I believe it shot some police officers.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was in Dallas.
So if something like and everybody's kind of calling it the boom bot, but my question is, and this is actually what made was, how would actually did accept electronic personhood? Would the military still be able to use drones the way they do, especially if those systems advance? Would they still be able to use the boom bots? What about deep sea exploration, or even sending the rovers to Mars? I mean,
well, none of those are autonomous, right? I mean, the boom bot and the drones that we have, at least as far as I know, the drones flying over the Middle East, killing people.
They have some.
They're all piloted or controlled by humans.
Yeah.
Now,
but they still have some autonomy, and I don't think the EU set a level on the amount of autonomy a electronic intelligence would have.
I mean, that's one big problem with the abortive effort by the EU to write some rules, is that it's clear that there's kind of a continuum among multiple dimensions, both intelligence, autonomy, and mobility, other things that you would want to take into account. But
yeah. And besides, has anybody here ever watched BattleBots?
Yeah, that's great.
Well,
what are we going to do about that?
Well, the thing is, when we talked about this in episode 3, which is quite a long time ago, Asimov's 3 laws for robotics. The problem you get into with the first law is not harming a human, right? is what if you have a choice where you have to harm some humans to save others? But still, I mean, the robot is trying somehow to maximize human survival.
This is a field of research right now. It's still kind of fringy, but the organization that's working on this, they call it the problem of friendly AI, and the issue they call the AI goal alignment problem, which is that whatever utility function you come up with for the robot or the artificial general intelligence, you have to. It's kind of impossible to fully specify what your ultimate concerns are. To avoid cases where you tell your robot you want it to produce as many paper clips as possible so you can sell them at Staples, and you have to avoid the robot trying to turn the entire universe into paper clips. This is their favorite example. So there's this group called the Machine Intelligence Research Institute out in California that has some small amount of private funding, and they produce some amount of peer review, not peer reviewed, but they're pumping out papers trying to think about this problem using a kind of mostly mathematical logic type approach. I don't think they're particularly close to resolving it in any way, but it's certainly something some people are worried about. Kind of, how do you come up with a robust version of Asimov's 3 laws for the?
Yeah, well, this is something we had back when I was a kid. The Foreman Project, Colossus. You remember that movie?
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. They programmed it to make peace, right? And it's decided the one way to make peace would be to blow up the entire world, and everybody that was one form of peace, right? And so it threatened to ignite all the nuclear weapons at once if there was not compliance with its dictates. But I've always been skeptical of this because any robot that is smart enough to think, well, here's how I turn the whole universe into paper clips, is also smart enough to say, why would I do that?
I don't know. My attitude is that this whole thing is wildly premature, and that the types of problems we're going to confront are going to involve just sort of everyday machine learning systems, not artificial general intelligences. And so,
yeah,
why are we worried about these sort of sci-fi scenarios that probably won't even realize anyway?
I mean, the one area which does worry me most, though, is that you give machine intelligence to the military, and they program those artificial intelligences to kill people. I mean, that's where it's going to break down. I mean, yeah, Google might produce something, or Elon Musk, and they'll have a good reason behind it, and they'll have plenty of safeguards. But programming it to go out and top people because it's less dangerous. You don't have to endanger people. Go into third world countries and kill people. That is where I think this.
Well, but is that less dangerous than taking a 19-year-old with a rifle and sending him in the same situation? I mean,
yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
We've had a lot of problems with doing that sort of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, we got to get our moral code together, because if we start teaching some of the machines what we've been learning, it's not going to end well.
We've been slaughtering each other since the Neolithic Revolution, if not earlier.
Oh yeah.
So
Actually, we've been slaughtering each other for longer than that. They always used to say that we invented warfare, but they've done some close studies of monkeys, and they found out that they actually, they have a homicide problem, but it's very rare and it's kept very quiet inside their societies. It happens away, and nobody knows about it. Right? It usually involves a female monkey, by the way.
Hope no one's surprised by that.
two males have a disagreement and one male walks away. Right, but there you go. So we're not entirely to blame for the invention of warfare and whatever. Yeah.
Well, our cousins also do the same sort of thing, but
yes, that's right. We didn't teach them; they learned it themselves.
But my point is that the danger comes really when we equip these AIs, which don't exist now, by the way. I mean, we're very good at narrow AI. We're not so good at general AI yet. I mean, we can program a computer to play Go or chess or drive a car, but we can't.
But recognizing humans and shooting them is a narrow AI problem that we're already. I think it's already solved. I'm sure.
Oh,
there are
is
like,
it?
Oh yeah, but I mean, it depends on what kind of weapons you equip them with, right?
Motion detector.
Yeah, I mean, is a narrow AI any more efficient at killing people than a 19-year-old Marine?
sure.
Probably not.
No, I'm sure it is because like an autonomous machine gun turret that can, aim it. It just aims much faster. It's probably you can build a robot that can swing the gun around and shoot more accurately. I'm sure it's strictly superior. I'm not like I don't think it's necessarily the most dangerous technology in the world. I think that probably governments will deploy these sorts of things reasonably responsibly for the most part, but it's certainly there's at least some cause for concern, especially given the kind of ridiculously bad state of cybersecurity that if somebody hacks the software on these things, then something pretty bad could happen.
Well, I think if it's deployed at all, it's not responsible. Giving a machine instructions to kill people purposely, it's just wrong. Sorry, that's my moral code.
Well, maybe giving anything or anyone instructions to kill people, not in self-defense would be wrong. I mean, that would be my.
Yeah. Here's what I was remembering. It's called the Dodom Super Aegis 2, a South Korean autonomous robot gun turret. Came out about 5 years ago.
Yeah, but I mean, it could easily be outsmarted, but right? I mean, it would just be.
I'm not so sure.
Picking out targets.
Compared to a 19-year-old South Korean soldier, it's probably comparable or better.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably knock it out with a rocket propelled grenade pretty easily. So I just my concern is, if you get general AI that has some kind of goal directed behavior that says, I must, and we've all seen these movies, right? Then you have, and it also has access to highly sophisticated weaponry, and is very difficult to destroy, and can perceive and counter threats as they come up. That's something different. All the things I just described to you are characteristic of a well-trained soldier. But we send these young men and women now into these situations and tell them to kill, and they not only can do it, they can do it in a very highly discriminatory way. The problem I think people worry about is AI is getting into a situation where they decide all these biological organisms are targets.
Yeah, in some sense, it's more like an area denial tactic, right? It's comparable to landmines, maybe, which people also have moral qualms about, I suppose, for quite similar reasons.
Well, I mean, if you value life more than your ideological or political goals, yeah, you might have qualms about it.
But also in terms of unintended consequences, lasting impacts, potential for not being kind of directly in line with the goals of the command structure of the military, right? When you deploy a minefield, you're creating a problem that somebody's going to have to deal with after the war's over.
Right.
And maybe deploying autonomous soldiers is.
But people in the fog of war don't really worry about what happens after the war's over, right? They just worry about
certainly true. Yeah.
Their immediate situation.
Mm-hmm. I suppose another way to look at it is that you put an AI in a battlefield situation and it's making value judgments. Those people out there, I have to kill them because they're going to try and kill me. I'm legitimate, but they wouldn't be there if we hadn't put the AI in the battlefield in the first place. I don't know. I know we have to sort out our moral code. Basically, there's just too much warfare at the moment, and adding AIs in the mix isn't going to help at all.
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, the idea of killing each other to solve our problems is just that's got to go. Right?
Yeah. It
In
doesn't work.
the long run. I mean, it's tough to be the first one that says that. Nobody wants to be the Quaker that says, "Okay, I won't kill you, but you can kill me," right? But the Quakers have done it, and they're still around.
Everybody likes the Quakers.
But the I think we're getting close to the end of our discussion. Pretty soon, I'll ask all my panelists for their recommendations, which can be anything. It doesn't have to be related to the discussion we've had tonight. So, James, are you still there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Can we start with you? What's your recommendation? Oh, maybe we can't start with James.
Can you hear me?
Well, James, you're kind of fading in and out. Let's go to Chris, and then maybe you can.
Okay. Following today's episode, I mean, I definitely recommend you keep an eye on Focus Fusion, because either they'll be big or they'll just blow up. See what's happening there. But as regards books, Iain Banks, the Culture series, that's pretty into the AI stuff. You'll like that. I'm still working my way through it, but it seems pretty entertaining to me.
Iain Banks, is that?
Iain Banks, IAIN Banks, yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely second that recommendation. That's great.
Okay. All right. How about you, James?
Okay. My recommendation is going to be Scott Sigler, and I've recommended him in the past, but he's got some really good stuff. He just finished up the broadcast of his second book in the Generations trilogy.
Scott,
basically,
sorry, James, you're kind of breaking up. Scott Sigler, is that right? Sigler. Okay.
Intergenerational almost. Yeah. Scott Sigler's Generations trilogy.
Okay.
It sounds like that's a podcast novel.
It's actually hardback books too.
Okay.
Okay.
He podcasts his books for free, and then they're good enough people buy them anyway.
Okay.
But this one's involves cloning, meeting alien races, 1,000-year-long trip through space, and of course, as usual, blood and gore.
Okay. How about you, Sam?
All right, my recommendation is a place to visit. I just got back from a trip to Australia, and I went to Uluru, also known as Ayers Rock. It's in the middle of the Australian outback. And it's particularly good if you like astronomy and stargazing. The resort there has some telescopes, small ones that you can check out the night sky, but it has extremely low light pollution, and because of the desert climate, it's clear pretty much every night. And it's also interesting for a northern hemisphere person to view the night sky in the southern hemisphere, because, for example, Scorpius, much higher in the sky, yeah. much more prominent constellation down there. And it was also interesting to learn that the Southern Cross is not actually due south. There's an interesting, I'll actually never forget this because it's an interesting algorithm. The Southern Cross is these 4 stars. They form a diamond, and then there's 2 stars off to the side called the guide star. And to find due south, what you do is you draw a line through the long axis of the diamond, and then you take the perpendicular bisector of the segment between the 2 guide stars, and then you intersect those 2 things, and that points due south. It's much more complicated than our algorithm in the northern hemisphere of point at Polaris.
Yeah. Could you see the Magellanic Clouds there?
Not with the naked eye, but I didn't look. I don't actually know where that is.
Okay.
Very
Well,
good view of Venus and Jupiter, and I saw with a telescope I could see Saturn's rings, so that was cool.
I'm envious. Okay, good.
I got a recommendation as well. When you actually post AIs with guns to guard jaywalkers, again, I want to know about it before I come over again.
Don't worry, we shoot jaywalkers only very infrequently here.
You miss more than you hit, eh?
Yeah, we're just not very good shots. That's the problem. My recommendation, being here in the U.S., we're in a bit of a silly season in politics, and there's one person who I really miss. I wish was here, but he's long gone, and that is Frank Zappa. And Frank could eviscerate with his political satire as well as his music. And so I'm going to recommend a random Frank Zappa album that I think, any of the ones I could recommend would be great. The one I thought of driving around today, going to get my daughter up from the barn, was Bongo Fury. It's very much in print. It's Frank's live collaboration with Captain Beefheart. It's brilliant. It's dirty. It's nasty. It's incredibly well played by great musicians. And so check out Bongo Fury by Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart. And
I gotta say that his album "Shake Your Booty" is, I think, one of the best named albums of all time.
Oh, yeah. Well, his band, the Mothers of Invention, that's the best band name ever. So,
Yes.
yeah, Shake Your Booty. Not his best work, but pretty good. And
what's the ugliest part of your body? That's one of his.
oh, there's so many good things. The man was incredibly prolific, a really talented musician, and a very sharp satirist. And anyway, so that's it for episode, I think I'm on 58 of the Unseen Podcast. And I'd like to thank my panel once again, Chris Profit.
Hi, right, glad to be here.
James Garrison.
Thanks, Paul.
And Sam Lichtenstein.
Thanks, Paul.
And just a couple of notices. We have switched to a public community on Google Plus for anyone who wants to be involved in the panel. If you'd like to be on an Unseen Podcast panel, you can be. There's nothing stopping you. Just come over to Google Plus. I'll have a link there's a link at unseenpodcast.com. That's where you want to go. Go over there. It's a public community. You don't have to ask to join. Just join the community. And you will get invitations to upcoming podcast recording sessions every 2 weeks. The next one is for episode, we just put out episode 60 today. 61 is coming up. That will be about Tabby Star. So if you want to discuss Tabby Star with us, show up for episode 61. You can still be on that panel. Episode 62 is wide open, and those invitations are coming out in September. Right now we're pretty low activity on Twitter and Facebook and Reddit because I am taking a break from most social media right now. But if you want to know more about us, come over to Google Plus. We have both a listeners community on Google Plus and a participants community. If you want to be on the podcast, join the participants community. If you just want to ask questions or make comments about the podcast, join the listeners community. You can also email us at unseenpodcast@gmail.com, or you can go straight to unseenpodcast.com and comment on the blog there. The blog will be moving soon, but we will make it very easy and clear where the blog's going and how to find it. So, because frankly, Blogger is just not cutting it for us, and we're going to move from Blogger to something that gives us a much easier workflow for generating the show notes and so forth. So stay tuned, and by all means, contact us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to know what you think of this show and other shows. As I mentioned, there are 57 other episodes before this one. And by the way, August was a good download month for us. It was the best one since we switched to the every 2 weeks format, or schedule, I should say. So thanks for listening, and hope you will join us again in 2 weeks. We don't know what the topic will be. Hey, you can influence that. Just send us an email. So once again, this has been episode 58 of the Unseen Podcast. Music is by DJ Spooky. Our panelists have been Chris Prophet, Sam Lichtenstein, and James Garrison. And goodbye for now.